Hey, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and Udon has finally wrapped up its set of one-shots for all the series that are a part of the main Mega Man timeline. The book's being called, funnily enough, Mega Man Timelines. And what's the best thing to do when we have a full series of something? That's right, pit them all against each other and rank them. Normally I do it based on my own preferences, but given that each comic was meant to test the waters and see what readers would want more of, judging them from a more general audience standpoint might not be a bad idea. Tell you what, I'll go through all 5 in release order, give a brief description along with its pluses and minuses, and wrap things up with my personal ranking, along with how well I think it'd do with newcomers picking it up on a whim. While I'll mention the general premise, I'll try to avoid spoilers, so if you're still considering picking any of these up, this might help too. Mega Man Timelines drops you right into an adaptation of Mega Man 11, one that I'm not sure exactly how far we're into. The action is pretty immediate, an inciting incident occurring that drags Mega Man into an encounter with 2 of the bosses from that game. Whether these are the first or last he's going up against, I don't know, and how closely it's following the source material is also a mystery. He never fights 2 at once in-game, and where they battle doesn't match up with either stage, so there's definitely some liberties being taken. But whether the game's premise is still the same, or if this is just the story using the same characters in the double gear is up in the air, but none of that really matters. Though there might not be a big setup or explanation for what's going on, you don't really need any of that to understand things. Mega Man's still fighting 2 Robot Masters with the powers he has in 11, and even if you were to walk in off the street and read through the book, no idea who any of these guys even are, everything's self-explanatory enough that you'd get the gist of things. At most, you might find yourself questioning whether Rock's a real boy or not. But a superhero with a gun arm fighting 2 guys who are clearly villains, using something called a power gear and a speed gear, is something anyone can immediately pick up. Not only that, but the characters featured are pretty well written, letting you really get a feel for what kind of people they are in this interpretation, and making it easy to get attached or even disgusted. The action is fun, it gets a little emotional at points, and it is, in my opinion, just a damn fine comic book that I'd recommend to anyone. It also introduces an element that will recur throughout the entire line, giving anyone looking to read all 5 books something to keep their eye out for, and, in perhaps their boldest move, ends things with a page that seems fully confident that they'll be able to continue the story. While that might wind up being a sore spot if this doesn't wind up getting any more issues, it certainly does suck you in and leave you wanting more, so for the purposes of really selling the book, I think it does an excellent job. It's third for me personally, and I'd say the second best book overall. X Timelines is a pretty faithful adaptation of the original game, specifically Chill Penguin's level. There's a few tweaks, such as throwing in Zero for a few pages and them giving an explanation for something that would have previously been considered just game design, but for the most part, if you've ever played through this stage and bothered to read through Chill Penguin's dating profile, you're not really gonna get anything new out of this. As someone who's played X1 probably dozens of times, I find this one kinda lame. It feels like anyone could have written it just by uploading their run and saying, "Now, put this on paper." Maybe I'm just harsh on this one because Classics book built up my expectations, maybe it's because I heard others glazing it as peak fiction, maybe it's because this one got approved for a full series just off of pre-order sales, meaning the writing didn't really matter, it could have been 20 pages of fart jokes and it still would have succeeded. This is pretty much the Nepo baby of the line. Your dad was a big deal, so you already had a job lined up before you finished school. But hey, I'm supposed to be objective here, and while I do think this one lacked ambition, I have to admit that playing it safe is safe. People came to this wanting to see X and Zero while getting a hit of nostalgia, and when you pull pretty darn closely from the thing that everybody loves, it's hard to screw that up. It's also one of the only issues to offer something like a synopsis at the beginning, getting readers up to speed. So while this is dead last for me, I do have to admit that it did what it set out to do pretty well, so I'd put it third overall. That might seem a little low, but I'm not the only one I'd seen complain about it being too close to the source material, so even if it is good for those with just a surface understanding of X, it does lose some of the longtime fans. Zero Timelines is a bridging story, taking place between Zero 1 and 2, and a Zero 1.5 is something that was considered at one point, so it's a good place to choose to flesh things out. It starts out with maybe the best action scene in the line, though when things take a breather, the story does start to have some issues. World building is one of the most exciting parts of adaptations, at least in my opinion, but I think what they try to do with this one-shot here overreaches a bit. It tries to simultaneously get people up to speed on the major events from the first game, while also setting the stage for the second, while also trying to introduce some new elements to expand the lore, And while I think they do an admirable job given the space limitations, it leaves the book not only feeling like you picked up a random issue of an ongoing series, but also like there's a bit too much packed in here, this feeling like it should have been spread across 2 issues by itself. Not only that, but there's also a few mistakes present. 2 of the characters getting their names goofed up, and some humans dressed as Reploids with some Reploids dressed as humans, which I initially thought of some plot reasons why this might have been the case, but hearing others discuss it, this could have just been due to a mix-up. All this leads to a book that, while I quite like, I do have to admit feels overambitious and a little rushed at points. While I see a lot of potential here and think that this could wind up being the strongest series if all the Timelines books wound up getting ongoings, as a one-shot, I think newer readers will walk away feeling like they only have a vague understanding of what just happened, and old fans of the Zero games grumbling about the errors. Me personally, I have enough of a Zero bias and love Ian Flynn's writing that this is my favorite, though for a more casual audience, I think it falls a little short, and I'd put it at 4. ZX Timelines kinda hurts. It's another faithful adaptation, perhaps even more so than X. It follows Ven and covers one of the regular boss battles, as well as the big intermission mission that takes place in the middle of the game. While there is some extra conversation after the initial fight and end of the issue to help give Ven some character development, there's a lot of dialogue not merely adapted but pulled directly from the game. Hence why this one might be the closest to the source material. And on one hand, ZX has more story to pull from, plus it might be the most obscure of the Mega Man series, so it can kinda get away with pulling more directly, but conversely, this also makes it a lot harder to follow. They kinda touch on what biometals are and some of the stuff that Ben's gone through, but it's only enough to give you a fuzzy idea of what's going on, and there's even some stuff that if you haven't played through the game and maybe even touched a bit of the previous Zero series, you're gonna have no idea what they're talking about. As for some of the other elements, it's got some good action scenes, and while some of the expressions are a little off, the inside art is a lot better than the cover would have you believe. But still, unless you're a ZX head, I find it hard to recommend this one. As such, while I played enough ZX to follow along, so I can put this as 4th for me personally, I think it's at the bottom when it comes to general audiences. What can I say about Legends Timelines other than they killed it? This one is an original story taking place between the first and second game, but you don't really need to know much to understand the book. Everyone's role is immediately obvious, them doing something to label them as friend or foe the first panel they appear in. While they don't waste a lot of time with exposition, some important concepts could explain naturally in dialogue, and they still manage to fit in a bunch of references that you don't need to get the story, but will be really appreciated by longtime fans. There's even a few that seem specifically there for the Marvel vs. Capcom crowd. All the characters feel pretty authentic to how they came across in the games, and most important of all, it's just a very fun little story that I think anyone can appreciate. Now, it does get saddled with wrapping up the entire line, that element from classic Timelines that I mentioned not only getting one last appearance but also the spotlight. This does seem targeted at either people who read the other 4 books, or to try to convince those who didn't that they should, but at the same time, it still feels like the sort of thing that could happen in Legends, and much like the game references, while you'll get more out of it if you're familiar with what it's calling back to, you won't feel lost if you happen to not be. Legends always managed to have strong writing and characters that did feel like they would work well as a Saturday morning cartoon or maybe even a comic, and this issue really highlights that. It demonstrates that it could get away with another issue, a limited series, an ongoing, or, with how nicely things are contained, even just this single book, though I'm obviously hoping against that last one. I'd honestly say that this was the best issue overall, and my second favorite, only held back because of my massive love of Zero. It really deserves the number 1 spot in both, though. As a bonus, we'll talk about the free Comic Book Day issue 0 that came out before the rest of these. It's just a quick little montage of 3 of Mega Man's previous fights, told from the perspectives of the Robot Masters he was up against. These are pulled from 3 separate titles, and much like classic Timelines, the events don't seem to match up with the setting or circumstances from the games, so they seem to be a very loose adaptation. Well, either that or original scenarios, but it does a good job of getting people prepared for how Timelines winds up tackling 11, even tying into that storyline a bit. Each scene also has a different artist, most of which wound up working on some of the other books or covers. The story jumps around, creating fun little snippets, but it isn't really as satisfying as one cohesive narrative, though I kinda think that that's what this offering called for. It was a freebie, meant to attract interest, and I think it manages to do that. It throws a bunch of action at readers, the constantly changing scenery showing that Mega Man has a lot to offer, which would probably be fun to see fleshed out. And by swapping between so many artists, even if this was primarily focused on classic, that also lets it serve as advertising for the following issues as well. While I probably like most of the one-shots better, I think the goal for this one was a little different anyway, so it wouldn't feel right to rank it with the rest. All I'll say is that I still like it, and that I think it accomplished its goal. And as luck would have it, Udon just made all of these available digitally on Neon Ichiban, as well as a bunch of Darkstalkers and Street Fighter stuff. They all seem to be priced the same as you'd get in a brick and mortar store, including the free comic book day issue being, surprise surprise, free. I'd recommend at least giving that a look, though if you've been unable to find copies, this is your chance, and if you've been mulling over which ones you want to pick up, hopefully my little spoiler-free reviews were helpful, though I do have more in-depth ones if you're still on the fence with any. With that, we can start wrapping up, so let me ask you, have you read any of these, which was your favorite, and will you finally wind up grabbing any of them, either based on my recommendation or just because they're finally readily available? Thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into retro games, especially Mega Man. Want to do one more video on these where I get someone with a more casual understanding of Mega Man to give him a look.